Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about diminished returns and training and why this actually occurs. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skill nut mark crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Alright, because that topic came up in my comments earlier this morning. Someone was asking about diminished returns, and it kind of begs the question of, we realize that pretty much in any given block of training, you are going to make less results than in previous blocks of training, whether you break that down into 6 months, you break it down by year. And in fact, what we've usually noticed is a rough guideline for someone who trains really hard, eats well. They're not doing a lot of dieting along the way. So in other words, they're not stopping and doing long cuts in between. So if you're just generally in a growth process, you tend to gain in your first year this big chunk of muscle and strength. And even if you follow just as good a programming in your second year, it's probably going to be about half. Then your third year is going to be about half again. And this is assuming you do everything really well, meaning it doesn't have to be perfect, but it just needs to be done properly, right? Sufficient training, hard training, plenty of overload, rest, recovery, all of that stuff, right? You're following a good program and you're working hard and you're eating well, right? That's what you see is that diminished returns. And in fact, it's not just for natties. You see the exact same thing in enhanced lifters. In other words, even if they stay on some substance at a given dose, they will see diminished returns from that also. In other words, X amount of Y substance that they're putting into their body, they might gain a certain amount of muscle in a time frame, and then in a later time frame of a similar length of time, they'll probably gain half. And then half again. And then it might come to a complete stop and they might not gain anything, depending on what's going on. And this has to do with a couple of factors. One of them has to do with just your body being resistant to putting on more muscle. And when you're resistant to putting on more muscle, it's harder to gain strength because there is a large correlation between the thickness of all those upper threshold muscle fibers and the amount of force a muscle can produce. There's other neural components, there's technique components, but the actual thickness of the strongest muscle fibers involved has an enormous impact. So you start seeing the same thing, and people would say with that, well, why? Well, it's because we, as a species, are the ancestors of humans who survived famines, ice ages, long periods of starvation. In other words, our body tries to metabolically adapt, and part of that is not adding muscle tissue that you don't have to add, because you put 20 pounds of muscle on, you burn more calories doing everything. You not just sleeping and laying around, but when you start becoming active and you start moving around, or let's say you go to your job, if you put on 20 pounds of muscle and you have even a semi physically active job, where you're on your feet a lot, your energy turnover is going to go up a lot. So you think about that from a survival perspective. If we're intended genetically and biologically to survive famines, part of that is that resistance to add muscle mass that isn't absolutely necessary. In other words, your body puts on muscle mass as a response to perceived risk of injury. That's why training actually does do that. It's your body's defense mechanism to keep you from getting hurt due to all these workloads of lifting you're doing. It's like, man, those muscles are going to tear. Man, you're going to get stuck under whatever you're trying to lift. So your body will gradually adapt to that by thickening those muscle fibers. But it comes at a high metabolic cost, so we're resistant to it. That's where things like myostatin and some of these other things that people talk about that they put names on for that you hear in passing here and there. That's part of what we're talking about. That's part of what things like myostatin do. That's why you see those Belgian blue bulls that are just massive, and it's because they don't have that myostatin gene apparently, and it lets them just be jacked. They're like bodybuilder cows, right? But that gene and all that is there to keep you alive, right? It's there to keep you alive. So the other factor to think about is also has to do with what I think Dr. Mike Israetel talks about of minimum effective volume versus maximum recoverable volume. Because here's the thing. Anytime you try to gain muscle, you have to stimulate that muscle growth, right? Now, we're fighting against things like myostatin and other factors in the body that's trying to prevent you from gaining muscle. It doesn't want you to gain unnecessary muscle. So what you find is that over time, the bigger you get, the stronger you get, the harder it is to gain more muscle, and not just harder as in work, but you have to actually put in a higher workload, meaning you might do X amount of reps and sets and gain decent muscle during a time period. And eventually you'll get to a point to where you have to do more than you were doing, unless you were doing a lot already. But if you were just doing the bare minimum to gain over the course of whatever time 5 pounds of muscle, right? You did just the bare minimum, your minimum effective volume. Your body is going to become eventually resistant to that. Your minimum effective volume is going to go up. You're going to actually have to subject the muscles to more work, not just weight on the bar, but sometimes more sets, more reps. That minimum threshold to stimulate new growth is going to go up over time. Now, you got to balance that with what can you recover from. You see where this can become a problem with diminished returns? In other words, you're also fighting a battle between doing enough work that you can actually grow from it versus how much can you recover from. Well, you start eventually getting to that threshold to where they start closing the gap to where you're having to add more and more training, but because you're adding more training, your recovery may not, and work capacity may not be going up in direct ratio anymore. So your work capacity increases over time, but at a certain point, you might be here, this is your maximum work capacity, maximum recoverable volume. Here is your minimum effective volume. They're both going up, but eventually this one's rising faster. And when they start catching each other, you're going to reach a period to where your minimum effective dose of training that you need to stimulate growth can start exceeding what you can recover from. So you're going to end up undulating. So in other words, you're going to have to go through eventually periods of time to where you're pushing beyond what you can recover from in terms of volume to continue to make gains. Well, you might only be able to do that for 1, 2, 3, 5 weeks, whatever it happens to be, and then you've got to back down. So then you'll adapt and you'll grow from that, but then you're going to have to back down sometimes, and then you're going to get windows of time where you're not growing at all. You might end up having a 2 or 3 week block here and there spaced out, and the more advanced you get, the more of those you're going to have, to where you can't fully recover from enough training volume to make more muscle growth happen. So that starts cutting down the amount of muscle you can gain in 6 months, a year, whatever, because you're not growing the entire time anymore. Because you're having to balance those two, because you're having to train so hard to gain new muscle that you can no longer recover from it. So you end up having to undulate periods of time where you're training more and backing off, then training more and backing off, in order to balance those two things. And that's where things like more food, more sleep and stuff come in. But again, we can increase that recovery on the other end, but that's finite also. You can only eat so much food before you get fat. That's why some of the strongest men in the world are carrying a lot of extra body fat, because they just go ahead and do that. You start reaching a point to where you can't, the sleep no longer helps. You can do extra rest, but you also have to do more than lay around and sleep and train all day unless that's your job. So what happens is that there's a balancing act that happens as well, and that means that you'll reach a point eventually, if you keep pushing and pushing, to where you might be spending less than half of the year actually growing, meaning through those blocks and phases you might find that for 5 or 6 months out of the year, or even only 4 months out of the year spaced out, are you actually gaining muscle at all? And the other 8 you're just struggling to maintain and recover again from the previous waves of pushing hard. And then when that starts happening, we start seeing the gains slow way down. And that's where a lot of guys choose to get help, who spent quite a few years building a base, because they don't like that diminished returns. They don't like that point of going, man, I can only gain 1 pound of muscle a year. Then all of a sudden I'm gaining half a pound of muscle a year and busting my ass. So it's that diminished returns becomes very, very real. And so that's the 2 different reasons why it happens. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.